Hello and welcome back to Community Economic Development. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about what is economic development, and then I'm going to talk about the arguments for local economic development planning listed in your textbook. So what is economic development? Edward Blakely, the author of your textbook, and Ted Bradshaw, the previous author of earlier editions of the textbook, used to list definitions in an earlier edition. They described local economic development as the process in which governments or community-based organizations engage to stimulate or maintain business activity and/or employment. The principal goal of local economic development is to stimulate local employment opportunities in sectors that improve the community using existing human, natural, and institutional resources. The International Economic Development Council, or the IEDC, is the largest international organization of economic developers. They also put out a publication called the Economic Development Reference Guide, and within that guide, there's a link to it right here, they provide also a definition of economic development. They state that it's typically described in terms of objectives, including creation of jobs and wealth, and improving quality of life. It's also described as a process that influences growth and restructuring of economy to enhance the economic well-being of a community. In their guide, they also list three major areas of economic development. First are the policies that government undertakes to meet broad economic objectives, including inflation control, high employment, and sustainable growth. Second are policies and programs to provide services, including building highways, managing parks, and providing medical access to the disadvantaged. Third are policies and programs explicitly directed at improving the business climate through specific efforts, business finance, marketing, neighborhood development, business retention and expansion, technology transfer, real estate development, and others. So you can see economic development covers a vast array of different strategies, everywhere from infrastructure improvement, highways, to managing parks and assets of a community, to very specific interventions in terms of improving the business climate and neighborhood development, business retention and expansion, or incubating technology and spurring innovation. So we're going to talk about several of these different strategies in this class. There's two broad themes of economic development planning. Now notice I'm talking about planning here, which is a little bit more interventionist than when we consider just economic development alone. The two big themes of economic development planning is first to understand the urban and regional economies. This would include things like the geography of a place, the history of a place, the economics, understanding the economy, and the sociology. Why do some cities grow while others decline? Why is there persistent inequality across space, across race, across gender, across class? These are important factors to consider when looking at a particular place. The second broad theme of economic development planning is intervention. How is economic development planning done? Why and how is intervention justified? What are the consequences of intervening? How can we evaluate the effects of our program, of our intervention, of our planning? And this constitutes different areas of planning, policy, and evaluation. So in other words, the first broad theme includes why do some communities thrive while others struggle? Secondly, what can and should be done about the problems? The arguments for economic development planning included in your book include three broad areas: globalization, rising inequality, and climate change. Under globalization, we're going to talk about the integration of national and local economies into one global economy, and then specifically the influence of outsourcing and insourcing. Under rising inequality, we'll talk about the new economy, income and earnings inequality, and spatial inequality. There's other additional arguments for economic development planning that we'll talk about later in the class as well. So under globalization, what are we talking about? We're talking mainly about market integration. Of course, we're talking about integration of markets internationally, integration of markets between different nations. But there's another type of integration, which is integration between different types of market. So for example, the Great Recession of 2007-2009 had a global impact. It had an impact across nations, even though it kind of started within the United States. But it also trickled over to other sectors within the economy, even though it started within the housing market. So there's a general agreement that the crisis had its roots in the subprime housing market. But how did it begin? Most people attribute the particular problem to something called the giant pool of money. And for those of you that are familiar with NPR and the program This American Life, they had a great program several years back called The Giant Pool of Money. And you could Google this and find this program and listen to it. It's an audio program on the radio. And it explains this in some great detail and in a very entertaining fashion. But basically the concept of the giant pool of money is this idea that there's a great amount of investment capital that exists throughout the world that is constantly looking for a safe place to invest that capital in a place that provides a pretty good return. So good return with little risk. At the time, shortly before the subprime housing market crisis, the Federal Reserve Board had what was considered a very loose, expansionary policy, a monetary policy. Something to understand with this is that the Federal Reserve Bank can influence monetary policy in a number of ways, but one of the key ways it does is by setting something called the federal funds target rate. And so at the federal funds rate is basically the interest rates that various banks charge one another for overnight lending to maintain required reserves, basically. And so each bank has to set a minimum amount of reserve, keep certain amounts of cash on hand. And so when they lend out more than that reserve and their minimum, they fall below their minimum reserves, they have to borrow immediately to replenish the reserves. And so they borrow from other banks, and the federal funds rate is that interest rate that the banks pay each other. And one thing the Federal Reserve Bank can do is it has a lot of influence on what those negotiated federal funds rates will be by setting something called the federal funds target rate. And the Federal Reserve Bank at the time was setting that rate a very, very low 1%. And by setting that very low, you can imagine there's a lot of lending going on. And so it makes, in other words, it makes the price of lending, the interest, relatively low. And so interest rates have been low for quite some time throughout the economy. But what that does to this global investment capital is it makes federal instruments, federal borrowing instruments in the U.S. government ridiculously low returns. So it doesn't make it very profitable to put that capital into government investments, securities. So you had this huge amount of investment capital looking again for relatively safe investments that provide a good return. And so what they discovered was mortgages. Mortgages became, U.S. mortgages became that kind of safe place to park great amount of capital that provided good returns. And so there was this big demand for mortgages. How do you essentially increase the amount of investments or the number of investment opportunities? But basically to securitize those mortgages, to bundle those mortgages and sell them out as an investment instrument. Something called basically a derivative. And so these things the mortgages got bundled together, sold out as a security, and they were traded around, and they got further and further from the banks that originated them. And so that just fueled more and more demand for more and more mortgages. So since they needed mortgages to back these securities, the pressure increased on the originating organizations, the banks and savings and loans and stuff that originated mortgages to basically lower and lower the standards. And so as you all know, some of these lending instruments, mortgage instruments got ridiculous, and you had to have basically, some of them became known as ninja loans, or no income, no job required to get a mortgage. And so there were a lot of bad mortgages made, and eventually the bubble burst, and that brought down everything. But just to kind of get a big sense of how the integration of these markets, the investment capital, the home mortgages, kind of all colliding together, and then when that burst, it really affected the capital market. So of course the banks and investment houses are going to be the first to fail. But what happened almost immediately is there was a decline in credit, right? Banks all of a sudden kind of froze up, the ones that didn't fail, and the ones that of course failed couldn't offer credit. But all of a sudden, consumers couldn't get credit for big ticket items, for like cars. And so the next thing that happens, of course, is the automobile industry fails. And then, of course, consumer spending constitutes roughly 70% of our GDP. So a decline in consumer spending, of course, is going to, by definition, result in a recession. And the U.S. economy's decline basically brought down the whole world. So this is the process of market integration that we all know of today as a globalization. That the fate of one market or one market segment within an economy can bring down the entire world, or have these ripple effects throughout, and we saw that certainly with the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. So globalization in general, Friedman in his famous book, The World is Flat, describes globalization in these three phases within the U.S. And so the first phase of globalization, or globalization 1.0, was a period that was really framed by government intervention. So this was a period where the U.S. government, namely, was promoting U.S. products overseas. So this is a period of sending goods abroad, and it provided significant prosperity to many local economies that were making manufactured goods. And so this is a period that really, it really took flight after World War I, but came into its grandest moment after World War II, and like the 1950s was really its heyday, where you had these communities throughout the United States, manufacturing towns, company towns that were making manufactured goods or even growing crops, and they were producing services and entertainment. Hollywood was going great during this time, and we were just tapping new markets around the world. And the United States, the government was heavily involved in promoting these goods overseas and so forth. So that was what Friedman refers to as globalization 1.0. In globalization 2.0, it's a multinational company that's really leading the charge. So this is a period of multinationals that really had no national loyalty. During this period, there was a lot of accessing overseas markets and employing labor in other nations. And so here, since these were multinational companies with plants throughout the world, they were always looking to, increase their profitability, and sometimes this was about lowering costs. A lot of these firms were heavily vertically integrated, meaning that they performed all of their operations in-house. They were very stable systems, stable companies that basically could afford to look for the lowest cost location. And a lot of times those lowest cost locations were overseas. And so as you had these multinational companies locating plants overseas, that brought plant closings on an accelerating scale to the U.S. Many local economies were unable to compete with the lower costs of production, labor costs in particular, overseas. But at the same time, because the U.S. consumer market is so lucrative for foreign companies to access, same time you had foreign-owned companies locating in the U.S. to access those markets. So you had factories that were owned by foreign companies opening up all throughout the United States and selling manufactured goods in the U.S. So this was a period really defined by the multinational company, and governments in general have had a really tough time trying to dictate or rein in or guide even multinational companies that don't really fall within in the rules of any one nation. Under globalization 3.0, this is a period we're now considered in, and this was a period of new technology. So this is the new economy and innovations, and this is where Friedman gets the title of his book, "The World is Flat." Right? Is these new technologies basically have flattened the world, making all locations much more close. And so the newcomers that came into this, so really globalization 2.0 was a competition between only Western countries, U.S. and European countries largely. Globalization 3.0, we saw the rise of China and the rise of India. So non-Western nations became able to compete globally. And this also forced big, rapid changes in traditional business development and recruitment. To how do we respond to the workforce demands, making our workforce able to compete so that all participants could be prepared and make maximum contributions within the local economy. So that's the era we're in. Basically, although globalization 2.0 hasn't totally disappeared, we still are dealing with many of the aspects of the multinational corporation, for example. To understand globalization, you really got to get a good handle on the influence of outsourcing and insourcing. By outsourcing, we mean the acquisition of goods and services from outside or foreign suppliers, especially in place of internal sources. So outsourcing, this is right when one company basically contracts out for the services or labor of another, or in another place. Insourcing is the opposite. It's using a nation's or organization's own workers or other resources to accomplish a task. So it's occurring internally. I mentioned in Globalization 2.0, we talked about the growing dominance of multinational firms within and outside the U.S. So in Globalization 2.0, we saw a lot of outsourcing with manufacturing jobs. And so, but the question was always like, which jobs are threatened by outsourcing, or which jobs could be gained by insourcing? And the tension or the dichotomy that we've always kind of drawn when it came to manufacturing jobs was the high skilled versus the low skilled. So while the U.S. government was losing low skilled manufacturing jobs or outsourcing low skilled manufacturing jobs, it was insourcing high skilled advanced manufacturing jobs. And we still see that, right? We see that overall manufacturing in the United States, if you look at manufacturing numbers in the United States, you will find that there has been a tremendous decline in employment in manufacturing. Does that mean that manufacturing itself has declined in the U.S.? No. Actually, the value added in manufacturing in the U.S. is very, very high. And the reason is the type of manufacturing that's occurring within the United States is advanced, heavily technological, heavily mechanized, advanced manufacturing, high-skilled workers that make really, really good money. But the very labor-intensive type of manufacturing, the low-skilled stuff, has been outsourced. It's still there is still some here, but again, that's the key dichotomy: is that the high-skilled, advanced manufacturing is being insourced, while the low-skilled manufacturing has been outsourced, and that's basically what we mean by Globalization 2.0. Under Globalization 3.0, where it's this new, flatter world, it's now the risk is to service jobs. And instead of being high-skilled versus low-skilled, it's not about that at all. And that makes it kind of frightening, right? It's no longer, can you skill up to a degree to be safe from being outsourced, from your skills being outsourced. No, now it comes down to the dichotomy between whether or not your occupation, your skills, can be delivered electronically versus not being deliverable. So again, under Globalization 3.0, and I always think this about the software developer, right? Okay, software developer used to be considered pretty high-tech, a coder or whatever. But can somebody develop software code overseas and transmit it electronically? Absolutely. So it's not at all about whether or not it's a high-skilled job. That takes great skill, but certainly coding and stuff like that, computer programming, can be transmitted electronically. So it's no longer about high-skilled versus low-skilled. It's now about whether it can be delivered electronically or not delivered electronically. So what kinds of things can't be delivered electronically? Basically what we mean are things that require some kind of, generally a face-to-face kind of interaction. Things that can't be delivered electronically or can't be outsourced. A lot of times research and development, R&D activities within a firm. The U.S. has just a tremendous agglomeration or amount of research and development activity still within the U.S. and probably not in danger of being outsourced. So those kinds of things, a lot of times business and finance can't really be outsourced. Activities that require trust relationships often can't be outsourced. They can't be delivered well electronically. But those kinds of things. And that's the distinction. So now it's really about service jobs. And, again, whether those things can be delivered electronically or not. A little bit more on outsourcing and insourcing. Another way of thinking about outsourcing is something we call horizontal integration. I mentioned vertical integration. back when I'd say up until about the 1970s, it used to be very beneficial for firms to get very large and to become somewhat insular, to basically close themselves off and to become self-contained in all their activities. So you would have, a manufacturing firm might have its own legal department, its own accounting department. It did everything internally, and by having everything in one place, it kind of freed itself up to move to low-cost places and so forth. In a modern day sense, we now think of firms as being much more nimble and being horizontally integrated or vertically disintegrated. So rather than holding all these different types of operations internally, they contract out across, and horizontally is what we mean, contracting out. So this involves networks and something called industry clusters. In my own work, in a paper I'm going to have you read a little later in this class, I refer to the term trading industry clusters. And what these are is these are clusters that can be identified as through trade interdependencies. And whatever interdependencies, purchases and sales. So these are firms that purchase goods and services from other firms. And this occurs both just firm to firm in the same industry, but also across different industries. So again, one business, manufacturing plant or company, manufacturing company might contract with a legal firm, and that's really more often the case than not nowadays. And so the idea here was is that eventually, firms don't do everything well, right? So they to be able to compete, they have to specialize in what they do best. And so when there's that real benefit to specialization, we call those diseconomies of scope. If you try to do too many things, you become incredibly inefficient at everything. So the idea here is that efficiency are achieved through vertical disintegration. Get rid of everything. You become extremely specialized in your value chain, and you contract out for the other inputs to whatever process that you need to produce your product. Now, I'm using this to define more of a manufacturing kind of process, but it makes as much sense in service industries as well. The blue ocean talked about by Kim and Malborn in their 2004 paper. It's the idea is that innovation comes through reinvention as well as new invention, and this similarly explains exactly why companies network now. One of the big costs of vertical integration. So again, vertical integration is that you have a company that's doing all of its activities internally. It's not relying on other businesses, or it's relying on other businesses to a very small degree. Once it does that, it closes itself off to innovation, basically. So you can imagine, I've got a company making buttons, and all of a sudden, if I do everything internally, including, my IT department, my computer department, everything's totally done in-house. If there's any big changes in the computing industry or whatever industries that I'm doing in-house, I'm going to be the last to know about those changes. So I'm going to be the slowest to innovate. So instead, if firms horizontally integrate, right, they're tapped in, and they're going to learn about things through what we call knowledge spillovers and the traffic that occurs. These knowledge spillovers should be carried through trade, right, through engagement with these networks, these buying and selling networks between companies. And so the blue ocean concept is the idea that innovation comes from reinvention as much as invention. So it can be that you have an existing company that's heavily horizontally integrated, tapped into all these other industries, and it reinvents its own product through that engagement with the other firms. And so that's the whole idea. And this is all, again, related to an important economic development concept introduced really by Joseph Schumpeter in 1942 called creative destruction. And Schumpeter refers to this process as the fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumer's goods, the new methods of production or transportation, the new markets, the new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprise creates. So there's this huge process of competition. And so if competition is such that if you fail to innovate, you fail to keep it, your business is dead, you better be horizontally integrated. So back in 1942, this was predicting all too well that, the key to success in capitalism would thrive on the ability to innovate. And innovation wasn't restricted only to the product creation. It was also includes things like the modes of transportation, the methods of production, and even the industrial organization. So again, the industrial organization that took place is, alongside of, the evolution of networks and industry clusters, just-in-time production, right? Not paying for huge cost of storing all of your wares in a warehouse, all of your inputs in a warehouse, and instead you schedule with your supply chain to have the inputs delivered to you just in time for their need into the manufacturing process, and then putting it out the door. So again, this huge engine of growth basically rests on every aspect of the company, and the only way that the company can be really efficient and effective is to innovate, and that causes it to be somewhat small, but also tapped into a wide variety of what we would call thick networks. And that's what we refer to as industry clusters, and I refer to specifically as trading industry clusters in my paper. So one of the themes or consequences is rising inequality, and this comes about as the new economy, and hopefully most of you are familiar with what's going on with the new economy, because there's a lot of consequences with it. The new economy is described by Atkinson and Korea as a global, entrepreneurial, and knowledge-based economy in which the keys to success lie in the extent to which knowledge, technology, and innovation are embedded in products and services. And they list 5 areas that define the new economy. So today's economy is 1, knowledge dependent. 2, it's global. 3, it's entrepreneurial. 4, it's rooted in information technology. And 5, it's driven by innovation. So given those kinds of things, you can imagine, right, is you could see right away that it's going to have dire consequences for people that aren't engaged in these 5 things. If they're not engaged in innovation, if they're not highly knowledgeable, it's going to have those consequences. If your region lacks an entrepreneurial spirit, or what we would call an entrepreneurial ecosystem, for example, it's going to suffer some consequences. So what are the consequences of the new economy? One of them is that jobs have become far more mobile than people. So I mentioned, for example, up until like the early 1970s, these businesses, the firms, had an objective to vertically integrate, and such largeness and vertical integration basically suggested that they would locate, facilities to low-cost regions and stay there. They'd be relatively stable. But since that, in the new economy, now jobs are much more mobile today, and people are more mobile than they used to be also. But the general belief is jobs have become far more mobile than people. Because of the dependence on technology and entrepreneurialism and so forth. This means that regions, in order for regions to grow and businesses to grow, they're going to have to tap into high human capital or the most creative people. And Richard Florida, in his book The Creative Class, he talks about this class of people, or people in highly creative occupations that seek a high quality of life and rewarding work. And so he suggests that economic growth is driven by creation of knowledge and ideas that primarily come from creative class occupations. I just want to take a moment to say, you got to be really careful with this concept. And the reason for that is, I think there's, without a question, businesses require high human capital to thrive, and regions require high human capital to thrive. But there's what we would refer to also as a high degree of endogeneity or simultaneity that kind of makes this concept very problematic. In other words, it can be incredibly difficult for a region that lacks a concentration of high human capital workers to somehow just immediately attract them. Because, just as this suggests, right, it suggests that people that are highly creative want to be in an area of high quality of life and rewarding work. So if rewarding work and high quality of life have to come first, how do you attract the creative class? And so, there's been a lot of implementations of Richard Florida's ideas that can be quite nonsensical, because again, it kind of suggests you're chasing the effect rather than the cause, so to speak. So you got to be a little bit careful with this one. The reasoning is quite circular when you come to this. But that said, Richard Florida's work is very, very popular in the economic development community. I just happen to be one of the critics that see it as not really helpful for bringing out what we would call like a way to turn around a declining region. I had you read McGranahan and Wohan, and of course they extend Florida's thesis to argue that creative class occupations are particularly important for future economic growth in rural areas. So again, the conclusion of this in the textbook of what all this together suggests is that all localities need to be careful to preserve natural amenities and to nurture cultural resources. That's good advice. Again, carefully preserving natural amenities and nurture cultural resources. That's not a dramatic change in policy or something. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. What I was referring to earlier, where I think some things can get carried away in trying to attract the creative class, is that the small town that says, hey, I need a raging nightclub, and somehow, if I build this raging nightclub, I'm gonna, that alone would attract the creative class. That's where I get a little pessimistic, where it would probably behoove that small town to instead focus on more fundamentals of economic development and just trying to establish a jobs base, for example. Along with this, has brought income and earnings inequality. And here's this diagram that was included, this graph that was included in your book, produced by the Congressional Budget Office, and it shows the growth in income by the various groups. And several of you probably have heard like the complaints of the 1% compared to the 99%. And here's evidence that, it's definitely true. Is that since, 1979 to 2011, as you can see, the top 1% income has grown 174% as of 2011, where the other groups, the next highest was the 81st to 99th percentile, grew by 56%. And then you could see these other two quintiles were right about 16%. So while all the groups, had been growing during this period in terms of income, you could see that the 1% incomes have been growing much more faster. And as you also read in your book, it can't be explained by worker productivity, right? Worker productivity has grown far faster than wages in this country. Just comment, the share of national income going to wages, which is less than 50%, is the lowest ever recorded. While the share going to corporate profits, 14.15%, is the highest ever recorded. So this means that the middle class is in great danger in our country right now. And this is an important economic development topic. The middle class standard of living has been the benchmark by which we measure economic development process. As Bushy and Hirsch state, a strong middle class is essential for a strong economy because it promotes development of human capital. What is human capital? Human capital, just like physical capital, can increase the value of a product, right? And by so does human ingenuity, and so we refer to human capital, the knowledge that the resources that an individual brings. So a strong middle class promotes learning, and it also creates a stable source of demand, right? If we've got a wealthy middle class, they're demanding new products, they're purchasing goods, and that helps economic growth. It also incubates entrepreneurs, right? The children of middle class parents will some of them will go on to be entrepreneurs and take those risks and start businesses and so forth. And then a strong middle class also supports inclusive political and economic institutions, which we all know. Democracy can be under a tremendous threat without a very viable middle class, and economic institutions as well. So out of this growing income and earnings inequality, we also see growing racial inequality, as race and income are highly, highly correlated. We've seen an increase in the numbers of working poor. These aren't welfare recipients. These are people that are working, but still earning wages below the poverty level. Foreign-born population, right? We've seen huge growth in the foreign-born population, and again, foreign-born generally correlated with lower incomes. So again, the book, I think, correctly mentions this both as a situation that needs intervention, right? That education, ways to kind of integrate the foreign-born population into our economy and our other institutions, but also as a huge opportunity for us as well. Particularly with declining birth rate, fertility rates in among the domestic population here. And then the prison populations, again, prison populations, the growth in African American male prison population is of a serious concern, and that creates basically a cycle of poverty, and the high recidivism rate of the prison population, and other problems. The book mentions some of the efforts to ban the box, for example, the ability for employers to ask a question on applications about whether you've been convicted of a crime, and that's used to just screen certain applicants out. This is an area that I actually had some involvement with when I was in Iowa, as I mentioned earlier, and I had some I took an economic development policy class inside a prison, and we worked with the job club inside the prison to develop a survey, finding out how employers felt about hiring persons with convictions, and we found out that yes, our society will continue to punish on their own offenders who have already already served their sentence, and at that point, no employer really has any right to continue to punish them, but they take it upon themselves. This leads to an interesting book, actually, by Michelle Alexander. Actually, I have a copy of it here. The New Jim Crow. If you ever get a chance to read this book, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And again, it talks about how the incarceration of the African American male, mass incarceration, has just led to generations of excluding them really from the labor market, and creating lots of problems. So as we think about in the future, how do we address our flat labor force growth, or even maybe declining labor force growth, we're going to have to be looking more and more to the foreign-born population as sources of labor, and the prison population, since most people in prison today will be released into society eventually. How can we integrate them into our economy in the future? So the real question then is that this means that the success of local education systems is a necessary foundation for local economic development. So the educational system is extremely important in all this. I want to also talk about spatial inequality. Regional inversion is a term that actually was termed by a former professor of mine when I was at UC Irvine, named Luis Suarez Villa. And he talked about this process where the Sun Belt states basically have overtaken to some degree the activities that originated in the Rust Belt and the Frost Belt. The Rust Belt being the Midwest, the Frost Belt being the Northeast. And so the idea of regional inversion actually started out kind of as a political exercise, at least in the West Coast, and in California, for example, the United States put a heavy investment in California aerospace, for example, but other Sunbelt states as well. Aerospace investments, creating so you put give a lot of aerospace contracts in certain places that creates jobs, population goes out, follows the jobs. The population then begin to vote, and that basically creates more money being diverted to those areas. The places eventually become more and more habitable, which creates more and more clout, and so this kind of thrives on itself, and they continue to grow. And so we've seen that process, right, where the manufacturing cities, or manufacturing, used to be heavily, in particular, concentrated in again, the Midwest and Northeast, and now it's becoming more and more concentrated in the South, somewhat due also to anti-union, right-to-work kind of stances, but for other reasons as well. And we've seen, in particularly, a lot of investment, foreign direct investment companies, factories by foreign automobiles, for example, or automobile manufacturers locating in the South rather than in, places like Michigan where they formerly were located. So one thing, so this has led to one form of spatial inequality, and certainly we also talk about the heartland, right? And the heartlands, as I mentioned already, alluded to, is suffering flat or declining labor force, a process we refer to as the hollowing out of the middle. And so, one thing we do know is that, wages are higher on the coasts, and they, have the ability to attract high human capital and so forth. And that kind of leaves behind the other states. And we've gone throughout history at various times policies that have tried to address basically a policy called even growth, which is basically that every place should be equally productive. An incredibly difficult strategy, and from a national perspective, it's not clear if that has a very high return on investment. Should you invest in places that are the least likely to have high returns, or do you place those investments on places that need the investments the most? And it's always a controversial kind of subject. Very similar controversy or similar subject is just how the metropolitan areas have changed over the years. And so here's a diagram from your book with showing the traditional monocentric structure here on the left. The monocentric structure, again, having the central business district at its core. And then right around the central business district is the central city. So beginning in and then surrounding the central city is the suburbs, and then outside the suburbs are the exurban or rural areas. Beginning in the really the 1970s, or often referred to as the dark era for cities, people began to abandon the central cities, or oftentimes it's referred to as white flight, because the white middle class was heading out and suburbanizing, and that left a lot of minorities and particularly new immigrants to populate the central cities. So that's really the old model, or the traditional model. Today we look at the urban structure as being much more polycentric and multi-ring. So we don't just talk about single suburbs. We talk about inner ring suburbs and outer ring suburbs. We also talk about subcenters within them. So subcenters might also sometimes, Joel Guru has a book called Edge Cities. So sometimes they're referred to as edge cities. A lot of subcenters or edge cities form typically at the intersection of major highways. For those of you in the, so let's, taking a look at this figure on the right, you can see you still have, your traditional downtown, or the oldest urban core, the CBD, and then you have what's referred to as the inner city. and then maybe an inner ring suburbs, and then the outer ring suburbs. And then maybe you've got some suburbs out on, or excuse me, subcenters out on the edge. So, and the type of inequality that's occurred now, for a while too, or recent times, we've been seeing some inner ring suburban decline, largely as, two things have been happening. Your older wealthy populations have been moving, further and further out, so leaving the inner ring suburbs for the outer ring suburbs. And at the same time, younger and wealthier persons have been returning to the central city, to the inner city, and in a process that we refer to as gentrification, generally negatively, buying up some of those the older properties, redoing them, and so what that's done is kind of pushed out, some of the older established, often African American, other minority, sometimes foreign-born population out into the inner ring suburbs. And so some of the inner ring suburbs have also have been in decline. As far as the sub-center model, here on the right, I'm showing you a map. Again, this is from my paper on the trading industry clusters, which you'll read a little bit later. But I just wanted to show you again kind of what this looks like on a map. You're looking at the Los Angeles metropolitan area, and you're looking at subcenters in the Los Angeles area that I identified. So here you're kind of looking at portions of 4 counties, and let's see. So here the county up on the top is Los Angeles County. If you see the subcenter, these numbers are ordered in terms of size and importance. So this largest subcenter with the number 1 next to it is actually in Los Angeles. It's the Garment District near downtown Los Angeles. That's the largest manufacturing center in the area. But you can see the second largest down here, which is number 2, is basically the Irvine, Santa Ana area. And so 1's kind of your traditional garment manufacturing. 2 is very high tech down south. So you see these subcenters cropping up, oftentimes again at the intersection of major highways. In terms of rural inequality, again, the story is that for those rural areas that are either close to a metropolitan area or have really strong geographic amenities, natural amenities such as mountains or close to the coast or whatever, you can be rural, but you're prospering if you have nice natural amenities or you're close to a metropolitan area, and you're in decline if you're natural resource dependent. So if you're strictly dependent on agriculture or and so forth, fishing or whatever, then you're more likely to be in decline and far from a metropolitan area. And then last, talk about climate change. Climate change is an essential reason for economic development today. So the United States produces more than 15% of the carbon dioxide in the world, even though it only has less than 5% of the world population. And we're expecting global temperatures to rise in the next century by as much as 11%, or excuse me, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. So what is this? What does climate change mean? It means a lot for coastal areas in particular. Sea level rise could inundate as much as or more than 70% of the largest metropolitan areas on the coasts, with up to 3 to 6 feet of water. It's also going to bring about more drought and desertification, more deserts. But in addition, we're seeing, a lot more disasters too, right? We're seeing a lot more fluctuations in our weather patterns and so forth. So disaster response is another issue of climate change. And this brings us really to two different approaches to climate change. One is mitigation. So basically trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions to at least delay some of the effects of global warming and so forth, versus adaptation, which is just taking climate change as a given and trying to prepare particularly the built environment for the effects, right? Preparing them for the flooding on the coast, the addition of 3 to 6 feet of water, for example, adapting to the change. A mitigation approach would be what I state above here. The only real recourse is for a new economy to emerge that is less dependent on fossil fuels and more oriented toward the production of low energy and low waste lifestyles. So getting us off of fossil fuels, certainly promoting renewable energy sources, wind and solar, and designing transportation systems that can get us out of the automobile in particular. This is also important because as I point out in a paper I just published in Regional Studies, a lot of things that we're doing now are in the wrong direction. I did this study on the use of tax increment financing in Iowa, and I show, for example, the use of tax increment financing to incentivize or reward, terrible jobs housing balance programs. So in other words, a plan or a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions would generally want to reduce commuting distances, so bring jobs closer to homes or homes closer to jobs. But as I pointed out in that report, Iowa's policy allows for just the opposite. It's actually discouraging houses to be anywhere near jobs and vice versa. So they're being incentivized to do the exact opposite. And so this is why economic development needs to be integrated really closely with these issues, so that we can design more sustainable development patterns, for example. So again, locally based economic development and employment generation are more likely to be successful if they're initiated at the community and local level than elsewhere. So this is an important time to be considering local economic development, community economic development. Again, it is related to a lot of important issues, one of which is climate change as well. So in this presentation, I talked a little bit about what is economic development. I talked about the arguments for local economic development planning, and I showed basically how these ideas are interrelated and connected.